please join me in welcoming Alain De Botton to the stage.
I believe wholeheartedly in the work that Relate does. I think it is one of the most important institutions in Britain, and it needs to be better funded. So if anyone can fund it more, please ask them to do it. But it is a wonderful thing. I'm a wholehearted advocate of psychotherapy. I think that everyone should have psychotherapy, have access to psychotherapy, and particularly the issues of relationships are absolutely central, because if we don't treat our psyches with the respect they deserve, they just wind up as producing all sorts of other problems which cost much more to fix. So fixing the psyche is a cheap thing to do. I'm speaking here as an author, but also as a representative of this institution you just heard called the School of Life. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the School of Life because it is an organization that believes in many of the things that Relate believes in, essentially emotional health through therapy. We're a therapeutic organization, and we spend a lot of our time working in therapy with people who are facing relationship problems. We also publish books, make films, and during the course of tonight's lecture, I will also be showing you a few films that the School of Life has made and that I wrote the scripts for, so you can blame me. But my colleagues also, I want to pay tribute to them. So most days of the week, we are there helping people to understand themselves better and make their relationships go better. The title of tonight's talk is Why Romanticism Killed Love. It's a bit of a paradoxical one, but let me try and add some flesh to the idea. It's worth starting by asking a really sort of basic question, which is, how many of us in the room expect that our relationships should be a major source of happiness? And it's a rhetorical question because pretty much all of us, what it is to be a modern person is to be someone who imagines that their relationship will not simply be a vehicle to, I don't know, further the next generation or meet societal expectations, but will deliver an intrinsic and authentic degree of satisfaction. That is just a fundamental core belief of modernity. And it is something that you can handily ascribe to the movement known to literary critics, historians, and others as Romanticism, which kicks off in about 1750. Luckily, it's not an academic audience, so let's just pin that date, 1750. We can quibble about when exactly it might have emerged. But loosely around 1750, this movement gets going, and it starts in the arts, etc., and it vitally shapes our sense of what love is meant to be about. Let's bear in mind that we love in a historical context. There's that lovely quote from La Rochefoucauld where he says, some people would never have fallen in love if they hadn't heard there was such a thing. In other words, we are guided by societal expectations and a sense of what's normal when pegging our own intimate lives. It's quite a paradox that something as intimate as love should actually be so connected up with societal movements more broadly. But I think that is absolutely the case. So, since about 1750, we have been loving as romantics. Now, there are a number of assumptions that Romanticism made, and it's worth just trying to draw back from the present and from our, we're up so close against Romanticism. It's worth just sort of looking at what was so particular about this movement known as Romanticism. Well, for a start, it argued that everybody has, waiting in the wings, or you've already discovered them, a soulmate. And this soulmate, also known as an angel, an angelic being, a very special being, is something that is for all of us, and we are going to discover them at some point. Now, Romanticism argued that the way you're going to discover them is not by asking your parents, not by reasoning logically, not by trying to meet normal criteria around money or societal beliefs, but what you will do is you'll need to follow your instinct. You will need to follow your heart. In other words, when you get a crush, that's when you know you found your angel, you found your soulmate. And that's why there's an immense respect that's given to romantic transports of emotion. This is a sign that you have found a suitable partner for the next 50 years or so, or shorter in those days, in the early days. That's why suddenly in romantic fiction and poetry, the crush, what I could, in loose language called the crush, has an enormous privileged position. You're sitting on the train. I mean, people are falling in love all the time in romantic novels in the 19th century, and a lot of them in railways. You're sitting in a carriage, somebody's, opposite you, so they look nice, the landscape's shooting by, and you just lock onto them, they lock onto you, and it's the beginning of something meaningful and true, much better than the arranged marriage which it replaces. As I mentioned, the soulmate is perfect, more or less perfect. They have to them a level of accomplishment of their soul, of their capacities, which is truly edifying and awesome. It's an awesome power. That another human being has a power to awe you is fundamental to Romanticism. Another basic tenet of Romanticism, it's going to last forever. It's till death do us part. That said, many of the Romantics died quite young. They met, and they, it was very passionate and great love affair. And then someone got a bit of a cough, and it's tuberculosis, and you're off the next month. But it was beautiful until then. So very much for the long term. Also, incidental point, in Romanticism, no one really has a job or needs to do very much, so there's a lot of time to indulge in love. There's not much sort of work-life balance conversation going on, because generally you're going for walks in the countryside. Nature becomes incredibly important. Sunsets, waterfalls, particular times of day are crucial, particularly dusk, when the sun is setting and turning the sky a kind of crimson shade. Very conducive to love. As I say, also waterfall and cliffs, very, very romantic places. Another core romantic belief is around sex. And the key thing is that sex, for the Romantics, is the supreme expression of love. So people have been having sex since the dawn of time, but what the Romantics do is to tie sex intimately to the experience of love. Love is crowned by sex. Sex is the consummate experience of love. It's beautiful, it's transporting, it's edifying. But one of the things that this belief does, of course, is to turn adultery from a problem into a tragedy. Because people, as adultery has always been problematic, but suddenly in the 19th century, people are killing themselves left, right, and center in its name. So most of the great 19th century novels have someone, I'm summarizing brutally, killing themselves because of love in one way or another. So Anna Karenina, Madame Bovary, Tass, d'Urberville, etc. So suddenly adultery, sexual transgression becomes enormously significant in a way that it perhaps hadn't been as much. Now, you'll guess from my tone, the title of the talk, etc., that I am a little bit skeptical about some of the founding beliefs of Romanticism. And I believe that if we're trying to get love back on track, we'll need to get rid of Romanticism. If we're going to make relationships work, we'll need to abandon many of the romantic beliefs which propelled us into them. Romanticism has, in this sense, killed love, or at least stands as the enemy of love. Now, why am I saying that? For a start, it's a real problem if two people get together and believe that each other is the angel. A notion of human perfection is very damning to any couple starting on the long road of life. The basic assumption that we are very imperfect and very broken creatures is a wonderful way to get a relationship going. One of the great predictors of if the couple's going to be happy is, when they meet, if they're able to say, well, I'm a broken, slightly disappointing individual in many ways, and I imagine, without knowing you, that you are too. This is fantastic. And of course, it doesn't sound very romantic. Now, whenever something doesn't sound romantic, it's normally a good idea. Everything that sounds romantic is a bad idea. Starting with this. So whenever you say, well, it doesn't sound very romantic, good. It's a great thing. So, we've abandoned the old idea in Judeo-Christian culture of original sin, in Latin peccatum originale. And this is an idea we find in St. Augustine, that basically every human being is flawed, is broken from the start. And therefore, any relationship is an encounter with a fellow broken human. And therefore, forgiveness and generosity is absolutely essential. But we have a hard time. Romanticism makes that very hard for us to believe. Seemingly out of generosity, you're so wonderful. But actually, the effect is intolerance and self-righteousness. I'm going to show you a little film that we made about a couple who believes that they have found their other half, but there's a fly in the ointment.
Freya, marry me. These are all my favourite albums.
No way. Oh, I love the 60s.
Nice. Mum and Dad?
Mum and Dad used to play
Mum and Dad.
all the time.
Good morning.
Morning.
What should we do today?
Well... We were supposed to see Rory and Emma.
Oh, yeah.
You don't want to?
No, it's not that I don't want to. It's just Rory. He can be a...
Bit of a dick.
Mm.
Just keep going.
you go, one for the lady.
Thank you.
Oh, almost forgot. You okay?
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. Don't you think that's a bit disgusting?
Don't knock it until you tried it.
I'm fine, thank you.
You okay?
It's fine, let's just eat.
Because if my tastes offend you, please do let me know. Yeah? What are you doing? What are you doing? What the fuck did you do that for?
You ruined it, it's your fault.
My fault. You're an ungrateful bitch, you know that?
Fuck you. Fuck you!
Fuck you!
It's a therapeutic context, so you'll understand that passions run high, particularly when ideals are there. So it's really trying to bring out the relationship between intolerance and adulation, idealism and, in a way, betrayed hopes, and the danger that's posed. And this is romanticism. I think if I press the button, there's an empty slide, and the next film won't start, but because it's a bit distracting to have him on the screen. Okay, just going to put that there. So the other thing, of course, the other assumption that Romanticism makes is that we don't have a particularly complex psychological history. But you all know that, of course, we do, that any human being who has reached adulthood is in some way or another traumatized or in difficulty around aspects of the developmental emotional process which has gone wrong. In other words, we're all a bit mad. And it's very handy to know how we are mad. Sanity is probably beyond us in most areas, but a knowledge of the multiple ways in which we are slightly insane or unbalanced is an extremely useful thing to bring into a relationship, something that Romanticism doesn't necessarily prepare us for. And there's a kind of veil of silence about how eccentric and mad we all are. Our friends don't tell us, well, they can't be bothered, they just want to have dinner with us every now and then. They don't want to go into the psyche. They know, but they don't want to bother. Our exes, well, they knew, but they didn't want to bother with it, so they just said they were going to India and needed a bit of space, etc. And our parents, well, they know full well, but again, they can't bear to tell us. They, a veil of sentimentality precludes them from telling us what's wrong. So we grow up sometimes thinking that, broadly speaking, we're not a particularly trying proposition to endure in a relationship. And this is a great error. One of the leading indicators that you will be a good person to be in a relationship with is an awareness that you're going to be a nightmare. Someone who thinks that they are an asset to another person rather than probably a bomb waiting to go off in their life is, very dangerous. So we need, a couple that's well suited on an early dinner date should be asking one another, how are you mad? I'm mad like this. How about you? And that way, through, jokey but tender and generous self-acceptance and acceptance of the other, can be inching towards a kind of conscious accommodation of the other's frailties and fragilities, which are going to be there, of course. Now, Romanticism, as I said, believes in the crush, that we get into relationships because and via instinct. This is a disaster. Instinct does not lead us to happiness. Why? Because let's go back and look at how instinct is formed. Even if you don't buy the whole of psychotherapy, we all probably accept nowadays that the way in which we love as adults sits on a template of early childhood love, which sounds lovely, except that most of us have, of course, known childhood love that was, in one way or another, a little bit difficult. And therefore, when an adult lover comes along, what we're looking for is not so much somebody who's going to optimize our chances of happiness and contentment and fulfillment, but someone, first and foremost, who will feel familiar. It's familiarity we're looking for rather than merely fulfillment. And this means that we make some pretty eccentric choices and set up some pretty distinctive patterns when we're in the relationship. Sometimes we'll be introduced to people who want to set us up. And they'll say, I've met a really lovely person. They're gorgeous, they're lovely, they've enjoyed their job, they'd be just right for you. And we meet them, and things are going well, and yet somehow, during the dinner date, we just feel it's not clicking somehow. We might even accuse them of being boring, a very key word. Whenever you find someone boring, an interesting word. So you say, they're kind of boring. And, then we don't call them again and we just let them go. And our friends ask us, what was wrong with them? And we don't really know. But really, deep down what's going on is this person wasn't quite damaged enough in order to make us suffer in the way that we need to suffer in order to feel that love is real. And love is the love that we deserve and feels authentic. And so very often we're involved in this, and an awareness of the basic patterns we're bringing into relationships is absolutely key. And most people in Britain who form relationships have absolutely no idea of the way in which their past is informing their partner choice or what's going to happen. The notion of attachment, for example, is completely foreign to almost everybody other than the people in this room. So it's extremely difficult to make headway because we live still under a culture. People will say things like, I had a mad attraction to somebody, I met them, and we're getting married next month, and everyone's so happy for us. And people will go, that sounds like a good idea, rather than call the police. This sounds like a terrible idea. Or call relate. This is a very dangerous idea. So again, it sounds romantic. And whenever it sounds romantic, it's a bad idea. The other thing, of course, that romanticism tells us is that when we find that very special person, there will be no more secrets. Secrecy is seen as the death and the end of love. We have to open our hearts fully to another person because the most important thing to do is to be entirely authentic. The word authenticity is absolutely key for romanticism. And there are some wonderful moments in the early days of relationships where this seems like it's possible, that we find, and it particularly occupies a position around sex, that whereas we'd previously been hidebound and frightened and shamed by the world and by other people, suddenly we find someone and we think they accept us. And this is what makes the early days so wonderful, that we have a sense of acceptance. And it normally lasts about 3 months, and often there's a scene like this that brings it to an end, which is we're sitting with our lover with whom we've discussed all sorts of things and explored all sorts of things, and then suddenly there's the waiter in the restaurant that we're in or the cafe that we're in, and maybe one of us says, oh, that person looks really kind of cute, and imagine if they came in to the couple and we to explore in the way that we were thinking about it. And suddenly you look at the partner and they look not just shocked but also hurt. And you think, oh my goodness, I'm up against a choice which romanticism neglects, a choice between honesty on the one hand and hurt on the other. How much do you dare to hurt someone with your truth? And romanticism tells you, well, there should be nothing hurtful inside you, because romanticism believes that everyone is born good and that there is nothing dangerous or difficult about human beings. Only society makes us dangerous and difficult, but our pure selves are good, and therefore we should be able to say anything. Well, there's often a fork in the road. Do you go down the path of total honesty, or do you go down the path of love, which may involve sometimes shielding things or reformulating things in a way that's not entirely true to what you feel, but is true to the ultimate purpose of you being in a relationship, which is to make love work between two people. Again, that nuance is terribly difficult for us nowadays. And often at the School of Life, we see people who say things like, well, honesty is the number one thing in my relationship. I need to be honest about everything. And we see how that honesty, that pledge to honesty plays out. And sometimes it's important to kind of nuance it and see that sometimes, a little lie becomes the guardian of a big truth. And what people want by honesty, well, it's complicated. Anyway, so that's one of the aspects. The other thing that romanticism tells us is that when you love somebody, when you find someone to love, you will understand each other without needing to speak, wordlessly. Music is the most important art form for romantics, and there's a suspicion of words, and there's often a romantic feeling that if you think too much, that's dangerous. Well, as we all know, thinking too much is a great idea. You can't think too much. You can only think wrongly, but you can't think too much. There's no such thing. But romanticism tells us, no, there's such a thing as thinking too much. And this means that there's a premium on wordless communication. And those moments in the early days of a relationship, again, where you lie with your lover and it seems like they understand you without you needing to finish the sentence. They get you without you needing to speak. And this sets up a very dangerous precedent. It sits on top of that early childhood baby belief that the parent can understand you without needing to speak. And that's how it was. But you were very, very simple as a creature to understand when you were very little. You're now much more complicated. But nevertheless, that dream of wordless understanding pursues us into adulthood and sets up a massive problem. Romanticism has unleashed a catastrophic explosion, an epidemic of sulking. Sulking is the consequence of romanticism, because sulking is based on the belief that the other can understand you without you needing to speak. We made a little film about sulking. I apologize for the swear words, a lot of swearing, but again, it's something that happens when love is enacted.
Yeah, it's all right though. I like it here. It's nice. Cambridge is okay, but a bit boring.
I can imagine.
Oh, hiya. What are you doing home so early?
There was a power outage at work. Sorry, what's going on here?
Gary here has fixed our lighting problem.
All right, mate, how you doing?
Ta-da!
I thought I told you I was going to fix that.
You wouldn't know where to start. I mean,
I've been really busy at work, you know that.
What do you do, mate?
I'm a surgeon.
Oh, nice. Well, look, I'll call you when I got kidney stone, and you can call me next time the bulb breaks.
or if the DVD stops working.
Okay, well, I'll leave you to it then.
Well, good to meet you, mate.
Evan, something's blocking the door, honey. Is everything all right in there?
Yes, everything's fine. Go away.
Has something happened at work?
Yeah, something happened at work.
Something I did, isn't it? Darling, just tell me what it is and then let's fix it, right?
Just fuck off, darling.
Come on, Evan, you're being ridiculous. Is this because of the electrician?
Why don't you fucking get him to change the batteries on your vibrator while you're at it?
Again, romanticism has made mind reading seem like it might be, a good idea or necessary, or possible even. The other thing that romanticism has set up for us is a belief that somebody who really loves us accepts the whole of us. And this is it owes something to the early moments of relationships, where it does sometimes seem that we have found somebody who gets things about us that others don't, who tolerates and is generous towards aspects of us that we, perhaps haven't met, that kind of tolerance in other contexts. So, I don't know, they see our old pair of pajamas, and rather than going, oh, you look terrible in those, they find us sweet, or they find us endearing, or maybe we've got a slight lisp, and rather than being short-tempered about it, they like us, they encourage us in this little flaw that we've got. And this is very tender and very compelling until, again, a few months down the line, it starts to fray at the edges. Let's imagine that you've come down for breakfast with your lover and things are going great, but you're eating maybe a kind of granola-ish cereal, and you're eating and they're eating it, and you suddenly kind of hear that there's really quite a kind of loud noise emanating from them. And because you haven't had that much sleep, you turn to them and you go, you just sound like a cow. And they go, oh my God, that's so rude. No one's ever accused me of doing that. And you say to them, that's because no one ever really loved you. And they go, but you're supposed to accept me for who I am. And you go, well, but I don't. I want you to be somebody different. And then you're up against that fundamental challenge of relationships, which is the balance between education and evolution on the one hand and acceptance on the other. Now, romanticism tells us love is about acceptance. Love me for who I really am. That's the battle cry of many a distraught lover in the middle of the night. Love me for who I am. What a crazy desire. Really? Love me for who you are? I mean, that's a very odd idea. Let's wheel back to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks had a far wiser idea. They started with the idea that all of us are very flawed, and that what love is, essentially, is a process of education, mutual education, undertaken under the umbrella of a kind of protective and generous spirit. That's what love is. So you admire certain aspects of a person, and those are the virtues. You admire somebody's virtues. What do you do with either their vices or things that are not so great? Well, you don't condemn, you try to educate. This sounds very, very odd, but that is how the ancient Greeks saw it. It would be very odd today if you said to your partner, I've been reading some Plato, and essentially what he's telling me is that I should help to educate you to deal, in a more fairer way with your mother, or not to lose your temper so much around work, etc., etc. The other person would kind of lose it and go, the bedroom is not a classroom. This is supposed to be romantic. It's not very romantic that you're my teacher suddenly. Now, the problem is that we don't know how to be teachers, and we don't know how to be good students. But I fundamentally believe that that is a role that we need to adopt. Now, teacher, the very word sounds pejorative, like, don't be my teacher. But of course, there are so many things that we need to learn. We need to be good students, and we need to be gentle teachers. Why are we not good teachers? We're not good teachers because we lose our temper. And why do we lose our temper? Because we're so scared. At the backdrop of many arguments between couples, essentially, why do we lose our temper going, do it like this, do it like that? Why are we humiliating? Because we're terrified that this other person that we've got together with is in the process of ruining our lives. And we're so frightened that we lose the power to educate. Or we nag, we despair that we'll get a message across, so we nag rather than convince and seduce. And on the other end of the spectrum, as it were the student role, we think, well, we've got nothing to learn. If this person is trying to teach me something, they can't love me. Rather than the opposite point of view, which is it's because they love you that they need to teach you certain things. And that this is a legitimate and acceptable part of love. Indeed, it is the essence of love. The essence of love is to try and educate the person and to try and become the best version of themselves. Two people trying to become the best version of themselves. What's the solution? Well, first solution, of course, is to go to Relate and have some psychotherapy. But really, what does that mean? I think that there are certain skills that we have to see love as a process that is going to involve skill rather than intuition. And a skill has to be learned. And therefore, there's going to be a process, and there are things to be acquired. Let me show you one film about what kind of learning means. Those of you who are in the sort of therapy field will know this immediately. When we're distraught and upset in love, it's not necessarily obvious how the other person can comfort us. We don't know how we like to be comforted, and we can't tell the other person how we want to be comforted because we don't know it ourselves. And so there are terrible situations where two parties will want essentially to help one another, but won't have the skills, the relationship skills to do this. So here's a relationship skill. Here's a little guide to relationship skill. Some of you will know it. And it's really about the issue of how you comfort somebody.
Hey. How's it going? Hey, what's up?
I've had the worst day. I'm just so sick of everything going wrong all the time. And now it looks like I'm going to lose my job.
Well, just talk to Janet. Talk to Janet. See if you can move into her department.
Just talk to Janet. What's Janet got to do with it? Why would I want to work in her department? I don't even like Janet.
This is good. This is really good because we've been talking about this for ages. You don't want to be there. And the only reason you wouldn't leave is because of the guilt. And now they've taken the guilt away. You're free. This is, if you think about it, this is the best thing that could have happened.
How on earth is staring down the barrel of unemployment suddenly the best thing that could have happened?
It's not good. It's not a good situation, but that's how life is, and it sucks.
Great. Just accept this. This is what's happening. That is not what I need you to say.
What we can do is make you feel better, run you a nice bath, ordering some pizza, or sit and watch a film or something, just have a nice night.
Right, is that literally your solution to every single problem in the world? Have a bath and a pizza? I don't want to have a bath and a pizza. Just shove the pizza in your mouth and stop speaking for a second.
Right. I'm going to stop trying to solve everything and just listen to you.
So, I got up really early for the meeting and they cancelled both trains.
Oh, my train was delayed as well. It was a bit of a... yeah.
Had to get on the bus. It was raining, I didn't have my umbrella, so I turn up 45 minutes late looking like a drowned rat to find Malcolm doing my presentation to the entire team, didn't give me any credit for it.
Incidentally, who here likes to be comforted with pessimism? Often the most obscure. I like it. Somebody says, like, let's look at the worst that can happen. I quite like it. Some of you. Okay. So what other skills are we going to need to know? We're going to need to learn to decode how we like to be comforted. Another skill we're going to need to learn is, well, in the School of Life, we call this learning to look at your partner as if they were a child. Now, this is rather surprising and perhaps rather insulting because we are, after all, adults. Nevertheless, there's a fascinating way in which when we deal with the difficult behavior of children, we naturally engage aspects of generosity and empathy and sympathy that are, shut off when we're dealing with another adult. Let's imagine you've come home from work, you're cooking your child some dinner, you're preparing a schnitzel, some broccoli, you give it to the kid, and it just, maybe it's 3 years old, and it just chucks the plate on the floor and goes, I don't want it, right? And what do? Do you turn around and go, I've had such a hard day at work. I can't believe you're doing this to me. You're trying to bring me down. You're trying to ruin my life. What's going on? No, you immediately start to engage empathetic skills. You think, he's had a hard day. She's got a tooth coming out. He's jealous of the younger sibling. Something to take the edge off a damning verdict. This is not how we arrive in adult relationships, where immediately, of course, we engage our more punitive sides. And the problem with being an adult is that we look like adults. We don't look like children. The great thing about children is that, they look small. And so you can see that they obviously can't cope very often. They often also have the benefit of crying, and their emotions show on their face. But as an adult, we look grown up. And this is a terribly hard thing to do because we have to bear in mind that beneath the sort of facade of a so-called adult is a weeping child, a furious child, a hurt child, etc. And this is going to make it very, very hard to be at once, hard and try and get a result. So we need, when we can manage it, to be as generous as we can, and with some of the generosity that we now know how to apply to children. We didn't apply generosity to children for hundreds of years. For most of the history of humanity, we were pretty tough towards children. But in the last, say, 50 years, thanks to pioneering work, Bowlby, Winnicott, etc., we now know we should be kind. And, that's been an amazing transformation. We still don't really know how to be kind to one another. We don't know how to negotiate the fragility in one another. This is a skill that's waiting for us. A sense of humor is another absolutely key skill in a relationship. It's not just having a laugh. There's an enormous progress that's made when we shift from looking at our lovers merely as idiots, right? Because we do, to that much more important thing, a lovable idiot. Think of the great lovable idiots in comedy, people like David Brent or Basil Fawlty. These people are monsters, but through comedy, we're able to see these people as lovable yet monstrous. And most of us actually are in that category. So the ability to spin some of our deepest disappointments into humor and to see the other person as a lovable idiot is a kind of huge achievement. There should be classes on comedy in this particular area of relationship life. Also, there should be classes on compatibility. Compatibility is an achievement of love. It isn't the precondition of love, which modern romanticism takes it to be. Nowadays we think, I want to find somebody who's totally compatible with me from the get-go. Dating sites are a nightmare for this because they keep trying to align perfect matches. Whereas, of course, as we know, you started to understand what love really involves when you start to love difference and start to negotiate with difference and deal with difference. That is love. But again, we don't factor this enough. I mean, broadly speaking, to get into a relationship with somebody is a very challenging thing and a very mean thing to do to somebody you claim to love, because you're going to be bringing an awesome amount of trouble into their life. And to be aware of that and to be suitably modest around that is absolutely kind of key. When it comes to sex, sex is an interesting one. I get asked a lot. Sure, some of you who are kind of working in this field professionally will get asked a lot. People come along with a question, what's the answer around sex? And what they mean by that very often is, how do you balance up the claims of sex and the claims of love? The demands of a long-term relationship and the requirements for sexual intensity. And it's one of the large problems that romanticism has bequeathed to us, principally by denying that it is a problem. Right? And there will be immense progress in simply accepting that it is a problem. And, I believe there is no answer. If by an answer we mean a loss-free situation, So, the Daily Mail will make adultery seem like a terrible idea and, the damned like this. And, other people will say, the more polyamorous, libertine wing of relationships will say, well, it's just great. It's just fine to have multiple relationships and to let sex, explore itself, etc., open relationships and so on. My own belief is there are losses on both sides. You can be totally faithful all your life. Good luck to you, that's fantastic, and you will have many, many pleasures. You will also have some suffering. You will be bored in the suburbs, and you will know that you're missing out. You really will be missing out. You want to go in the other way, you want to have a kind of free love and free sex and all the rest of it, good luck to you as well, because it's going to be great fun and really exciting, etc., but, probably you'll really hurt children, and you'll hurt other people, and you'll hurt yourself, etc., etc., so good luck to you as well. In other words, there is no answer, if by answer we mean a loss-free proposal. And so the very question that we're asking is the wrong question. We shouldn't ask, what is the answer? We should, the melancholy position is the only one. One of the great exports of Britain is melancholy. Melancholy music, melancholy art. It's one of the great things that we do well here. And we know how to do this. And I think sometimes a degree of pessimism in many areas of life is the enemy of progress. But in love, calculated doses of pessimism is the friend of a successful relationship. That's just a flavour of it. I'm going on much too long. I'm going to end it. But before I end it, what I want to do is, so at the School of Life, we were thinking a lot about relationships and what to do about them and how to help them. So we run a counselling service, etc., etc. But one of the things we decided to do was to reinvent the marriage service and to look at marriage, the actual moment of marriage, because it seems that so many of the myths of romanticism enter at that point. Everything from the obsession with, how the seating plan is going to work at the dinner, etc., to, even the vows that people make, etc. It doesn't seem attuned to the real challenges. So it was on that basis that we wrote a book called How to Get Married, which just has been published, and it includes lots of advice about before marriage and lots of advice about after marriage, but it also includes a marriage service. Now, this is deeply eccentric, so forgive me, but we've decided to try and imagine what would a different kind of marriage service look like. So we've reinvented, this is a world premiere of the School of Life's new marriage service. Thank you to Relate for allowing us the chance to show it. So here we go.
The way we get married has changed very little for centuries, but what we expect from marriages has changed beyond recognition. We know so much now about why marriages go wrong, but so little of that knowledge ever makes it into the wedding ceremony itself. That's why we've decided to redesign the marriage ceremony, creating a modern event that's more realistic and more psychological, and therefore better able to help a couple with the joys and sorrows of life together. People still long for ritual and formality. A wedding remains a big deal, and it's good to reflect that in the dignity of the clothes and the setting. Let's listen in on what happens in our designed marriage ceremony.
We are gathered today for a solemn event, profoundly hopeful, but infinitely difficult. We're here to celebrate the wedding of Emily and Simon. A good marriage is not one from which troubles are magically absent. It is one in which troubles are faced with insight and generosity.
There are a series of rituals in the wedding ceremony. Things kick off with what's called the ritual of humility.
Humility is probably the most important emotion for the success of a relationship. Humility starts with an ample, accurate, and sorrowful recognition of all one's failings. It is filled with apology and modesty. It doesn't pretend that flaws are charming quirks or excusable oddities. It contains an open admission that we wish we were different and better. Simon, do you admit that you're a failed, broken human being? Not in every way, but in some ways so serious that you will at points be a grave burden to Emily.
Yes, I admit I am failed and broken.
Before coming here today, freely and openly and after careful reflection, you have listed your failings as you recognize them. You've listed them in this book. This is your book of imperfections. Would you now, before me, your partner and your guests, read some of what you have stated in your own words?
I acknowledge that I'm not good at communicating my feelings maturely. I won't say what's bothering me, but instead sulk. and expect you to read my mind and get furious at you when you can't. I can be quite self-involved. I tend to assume that if you're upset, it's something about me. I get jealous even over small incidents and become petty and hateful instead of showing that I'm afraid of losing you.
Both partners admit to their multiple faults. Self-righteousness is, after all, the great enemy of love.
Neither of us is fully sane or healthy. We are committed to treating each other as broken people with enormous kindness and imagination when we can manage it.
There is nothing odd about this couple beyond the ordinary oddness that is everyone's lot. They've merely put into words the errors and failings of which we're all continuously guilty.
We are all broken. We have all been idiots and will be idiots again. We are all difficult to live with. We sulk and get angry, blame others for our own mistakes, have strange obsessions and fail to compromise. We are here to make sense of the people feelings. We'll never know all the details, but we understand.
Next comes what we call the ritual of charity.
Charity is at the heart of love. Charity means finding the least alarming, least panicked view of why the other is acting as they are. It sees the fear behind the aggression. It sees the loneliness at the root of a sulk. It recognizes how shame can make a person defiant and how a hidden worry can unleash excessive harshness. Will you now exchange the ritual gifts of charity? The couple are exchanging photographs of one another from childhood. We naturally act towards a child with a spirit of love we often find it hard to adopt towards adults. This exchange of childhood images symbolizes a commitment to treat one another with the kindness one wouldn't hesitate to show a child, but so often refuse grown-ups.
I will place this child version of you at the center of my love. I will try to see your faults as a consequence of troubles in your past. I will look after the broken child within you.
Your partner was a child, and they are still somewhere, the same person they once were. When you shout, you are shouting at this child. When you betray, you are betraying this child. When you blame, you are blaming this child. The photo urges patience, tolerance, and warmth.
Lastly comes the exchange of rings and the spousal vow.
Knowing all this, fearing all this, hoping all this, will you, in front of us all, vow to wed each other? Will you agree to share your lives with all the restraint and sorrow that will be involved, as well as the joy and the kindness and the friendship?
We do.
I now declare you married.
Our marriages were, or are, or will be, very far from perfect. But we can learn and recover and improve. May your wisdom increase. May this marriage be enough. And with all our hearts, we wish you the best.
No marriage is ever without serious challenges, but starting a marriage with a wedding ceremony that's alive to these challenges and gives us some gentle guidance on how to avoid them helps us to get off on the right footing.
Obviously, when people first saw this, they said, "Are you a cult?" And we're not really a cult. But, you know, we were just, what does it mean to be a ceremony? We were trying to figure that question out. So forgive me if it seemed a bit odd. We're aware of the oddity, but anyway, we had a go. I think now is the time to have a chat on stage. So I'd like to ask my fellow correspondents on love to the stage. But thank you so much for listening, and the evening isn't over yet. So,
My burning question is, what's your advice to Harry and Meghan?
well, we have sent a book to the palace, and
Have you?
no, we haven't.
Oh God, I bought
No,
that.
but I mean, well, much the same as for anyone else. They're not special. I mean, they have a particular problem because they are right in the middle of our society's romantic fantasies. So the number one thing to say, and it would help other people, not so much them, but other people so much, if they said, we really love each other and we're really committed, but in many ways we're going to slip up, we're going to be unhappy. There will be moments when both of us think this is the biggest mistake of our lives. Yeah. And that's a good marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no marriage that unfolds without one or the other person, hopefully at a different time, thinking that this is the biggest mistake. And if they said it, and said it within a spirit of love, within a context of love, that would be tremendously helpful for couples all over the country who are, so again, the number one danger of the royal wedding is that it's very romantic. It's a very romantic occasion. Yeah. Big danger.
Yeah, we've seen that in the past, but still we perpetuate that myth.
I mean, if there was one lesson in this poor Harry's family history, it's that this kind of romanticism is so dangerous. And I mean, he hasn't quite got there, or maybe it's very hard for him to say. I'm sure he does know because he seems very enlightened. That the way in which relationships succeed is via the path of understanding some very complex psychological dynamics, and without wrestling with those, they've got no chance. So, yeah,
Great.
They need to come to relate. And they will, I'm sure
they will.
They will.
Did you hear that, Chris?
Mother was our patron.
Exactly.
Does anyone have any questions for Anna?
Yeah. But the question about accepting somebody for who they are, because one of the things I sometimes see is the danger of people saying, I can change them. I can go into this relationship, I can change them. And actually, I think that's quite dangerous. I think we do need to accept that people are flawed. And sometimes that thing of teaching, it's okay, I can teach them how they need to be, I think is quite a difficult one. So I just wonder if you could unpack that a little bit more.
I mean, I think it has to come, first of all, from a mutual acceptance that both people need to learn. So rather than, I'm going to change that person, the first thing is, I need to grow. And of course, it's a winning strategy. I mean, if you're in a couple and you say, you know what, I've been thinking about it and you need to grow, it's not going to work. If you start off by going, you know what, I've been thinking about it and I need to grow. I'm so flawed. Wow, that's if we're going to use the word, that's properly romantic. One of the most romantic things you can say is to say, you know what, I'm difficult and I've been really sort of learning things about myself and I'd like to become a better person. Even if you're not already a better person, it's the biggest gift you can give somebody. So I think I would do it that way around. So there is growth, but it comes from each person recognizing it and really reaching out to the other person and mutual support around that idea.
What's interesting about that as well is that sort of romantic idea that you shouldn't want to change the other person, that there should be the acceptance, and we have that in our intimate relationships, yet we have performance appraisals all the time at work where we're looking at our development and our performance, and we seem to change the narrative when it comes to the workplace. We don't necessarily have those performance appraisals in our relationships or the opportunity to have the annual appraisal, how it's going. The other thing that's interesting about what Alan talked about, though, was about, we're having the longest relationships that we've ever had on the face of planet Earth. We never expected to be married to the same person or in a relationship with them for 60 or 70 years. And it struck me, we had Charles Handy do our annual lecture for our 75th 5 years ago. And he talked about the fact that he's had 3 marriages to the same person and that he's recreated those relationships in his 50-year marriage to Elizabeth. His first marriage was all about him. The second marriage was very difficult. And the third marriage has been about a balance in the relationship between their interests, because actually have some commonality in what they're interested in, but they have some differences, and they've achieved that consensus. But there's 3 marriages in one relationship, which was really interesting.
Considering the negative impact that unhealthy relationships have, from domestic abuse to mental health to many other consequences, why do you think there's so little attention given in public policy to healthy relationships?
Because we're a new species. We've only been walking the earth for a relatively short time. And it's you'd think that we've got there, but we haven't got there. In other words, there is no good reason. We're going to get round to it. We're going to realize, in 200 years' time, it will seem insane that we didn't pay greater attention to this. We're still getting going. It is peculiar that, so much of human happiness is dependent on the quality of people's relationships, and yet so little money and time and effort is spent in the study of it. I mean, something like, over a lifetime satisfaction is determined by relationships to a level of almost 70% or so, is determined by the quality of your relationship. So a Martian or an outside observer extrapolating from that would think, well, if 70% of happiness comes from relationships, you'd expect that 70% of people's leisure time, discretionary spending, etc., would be spent on improving their relationships. And of course, it's nothing. It's like 0.0001%. So there's a complete mismatch between what a relationship can deliver and what we're willing to invest. And indeed, we see the very concept of investment as unromantic. So it's, we're going to get round to it. And I think that, amazing organizations like Relate are kind of leading the way here. And there is no good reason.
It's a comment, really, and I'd like your views on it. What really struck me in the talk, and I really enjoyed the talk, was that my resonance with my female friends, and that I feel that with my female friends, and this is my whole life, I'm attracted to women who are beautiful and strong and smart and have great jobs, but I love them when I know they're not. I love them when we expose ourselves. I love them when I find out she's as frightened as I am and as hung up as I am about what we don't do well. But I never thought of that in terms of my relationship with men. I always thought of that in terms of my relationship with women.
I mean, in a way, what we call connection is allowing another person to witness us, not at our most heroic and strong, but precisely in our most broken and vulnerable forms. That is what it means to be intimate with somebody. Intimacy is a kind of negotiation with, the sadness, the woundedness, the anger inside us. It's very difficult to show another person that, but it's also one of the loveliest things. If somebody can witness us and not be too tough on us, to look at us with love, with generosity, with sympathy, not necessarily with unfair or unuseful indulgence, but essentially to kind of look at us through the eyes of love. That is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing we can do to somebody. And if somebody says, like, what is a really lovely thing to do with someone? It's not going out for dinner, etc. It's allowing someone to be weak and broken and not taking fright and being strong enough to support them at that moment. But we don't even know that's a goal. I mean, we stumble on such moments. We don't know that they should be, as much national goals as anything else that's sort of actively flagged up. So we're still stumbling around. But I mean, it's still the very beginning. I mean, Freud wrote The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. And so it's just the start. And, our knowledge of relationships and how people tick is advancing, yearly. And, organizations like Relate are the kind of the end of the funnel, which is taking out the message into the broader world. But, there's wonderful research going on. There's wonderful thinking going on. What we also need is popularization to change the climate of opinion so that the current view of relationships will one day seem utterly shocking and barbaric. And it's like, really? In 2018, that's what people thought about relationships? And there are so many improvements we need to make.
Do you think, though, that the way our society is structured against being vulnerable? So if you want to be vulnerable and open with a group of people at work, it will be seen as a weakness and therefore exploited.
I think one has to beware, yes, absolutely. I think one has to beware of being too punitive around the request that people be vulnerable. Because I think you have to be generous about why people are not vulnerable. Most of the time, people are not vulnerable because vulnerability was intolerable when first encountered, right? You can't negotiate the path from defense to vulnerability because, normally in early childhood, certain traumatic events happened which meant that path, which should be a passable path, was blocked. And so people become too brave for their own good. And the world is very tough and the world is very damaging. So you have to be very kind of generous. And I think there can be, sometimes too much of a complaint, like, he's not vulnerable enough, she's not vulnerable enough. It can sound like an order. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the most frightening things for people who are already a little bit scared is, show me your vulnerable side. Ooh, wow, you need to take that request with great care.
And I think think it also runs counter to the sort of narrative today, which is about the kind of importance of dating. You know, and one of our counsellors, many will know, Barbara Bloomfield. I mean, I heard her speak in the House of Lords recently, and she talked about the fact that perhaps we need a campaign about the kind of benefits of long-term relationships, because there's quite a lot of debate about dating. And I think that some of that, you know, what you're talking about, Alan, is running counter to what's happening, because almost on Naomi's point there, it's being turbocharged by social media, that the way we're using social media is we're creating almost an alternative self. You know, you go onto Facebook on Christmas Day and it's awash with presidents, you know, and the kind of perfect turkeys are being cooked, not the burnt turkeys, and not the family rows when people are sulking in the bedroom. You know, you know, a friend of mine recently posted a picture of her family holiday in Hawaii. It was my friend Shannon and her husband and their 2 kids, and she posted pictures of her kids screaming with snotty noses because that was her experience. And she wrote, "I'm not taking the children next time," you know. You know, but that's not part of our sort of narrative there, and almost that kind of vulnerability not being shown, but actually being kind of quite counter to how we're social media. Now, the technology isn't the problem there, it's how we're using it, it's how we're behaving around it. And the sort of the last point from there about that sort of dating thing, about what you're talking about, is that, you know, my concern is that the kind of reducing how we look for a partner to an image that we swipe is almost commodifying us. And, you know, it's not a real image. It's the perfect image that you've taken 50 selfies before you use that image. And it's running counter to what you're talking about in terms of that compatibility. Or, I mean, I just read Alan's book, The Course of Love, and it's an amazing book. I definitely recommend you should read it. But, you know, the kind of importance of, actually, if you leave your socks on the floor, it is quite annoying. And that's a legitimate thing to be annoyed about, actually. You know, it's true.
Okay. I think we have time for just one more question, so...
I know you joked about spelling out our flaws on a first date, but do you think there is a golden time in a relationship to actually state those flaws? And do you think we should be stating them rather than letting them slowly creep out through our actions in a relationship?
I think it's good to get them out early, before those flaws have hurt the partner. Because by the time they've hurt the partner will be much less well disposed towards them. So before you've damaged the other person is the moment to, and when, you know, there's maximum generosity. But I think it's tremendously reassuring in a relationship to meet with self-understanding on the part of the other person. And for the other person to say, look, I know I've got a problem in this area, it's a very winning thing, because it implies, you know, problems, yes, but more important, because everybody has problems, it implies, you know, self-awareness. And that's so important, because if you have sufficient self-awareness and sufficient modesty, you can get through pretty much anything. It's the absence of self-awareness and the absence of modesty and the kind of rigidity and self-righteousness. These are the things that doom relationships. You know, when somebody goes, "It's not my fault, you're the one who's ill, you know, you're the one who's got the problem," that's when things get into trouble. Maybe one more question?
One more?
No,
one.
Yeah.
Can I, that was brilliant, as everybody said, and really helpful. But can I ask you whether you think there are 2 perhaps larger questions which come out of it? One is that the best time to do this kind of self-confession is when your relationship is young and forgiving and flexible. In other words, shouldn't relate be pouring a lot of effort and resources, if they had them, and I appreciate the problems, into education about relationships at a time when you're, as I say, when you can take it. So marriage education, if you like, and also isn't the message that comes from your brilliant idea about the alternative wedding service, nevertheless, that in order to weather the difficult times that we will all face, you do need a solid commitment in front of your friends, like you illustrated, which we call a wedding, and which I quite agree with you is so full of ridiculous expectations that it's almost bound to fail. So would you agree with me that, I mean, pouring money into relates effort, which they do so well at the end, is fine, but we should match it with similar available resources for people at the beginning?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, the standard wedding gift nowadays should be a course of relationship therapy. That should be. And in fact, at the School of Life, we've just produced some lovely vouchers, and we are recommending to people that really that's the number one thing that you should do. And
Semi-serious. No. Don't you think, actually, we would be doing a favour to people saying, one, you do need to make a commitment to one another in front of your friends.
Yeah.
And two, we're not going to let you do it until you have done such a course.
Absolutely. And I think, let's remember that the point of marriage nowadays is to create a hurdle to running out. Because in every good marriage, at various points, you want to run away. And because it's difficult. And often that difficulty is because another person is getting close to knowing us. And being known is quite frightening. And so that's the moment often we want to run away, and we're up against some difficult things. So that's why you invite your elderly aunt and your uncle and that person you don't really like from work, but who's quite intimidating, because you want to create the maximum embarrassment that if you've got to call them all up and go, you know what, that TV you gave me, etc., I've got to give it all back because, we're splitting up. You want to create a hurdle. Marriage is a kind of prison that you put yourself into and throw away the key because you know it's good for you. You know that you are encountering there certain problems you would encounter in every relationship. And I don't mean a prison, really. What I mean is a secure base. And because it's a secure base, you're then free to explore things which there's no incentive to do in a more short-term relationship. So thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Relate. Relate is a wonderful institution, and I'm such a fan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's amazing. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.